In my view, Tony sort of invented morphing. Long before there were computers to squeeze those little dots, so like a cookie dough. He was busy in the cauldron of ideas, using a disciplined mind to shape often radical ideas far outside of the straitjacket of conventional scholarship. He was then and is now a high-wire act, risking his life and limb molding concepts without actually so much as a backup disk. Yet somehow, and miraculously, it seems to me, he gives enough footnotes, notes, and bibliographic backup to keep the sticklers for detail in line and make his arguments stick. Though I actually haven't yet surfed all the links that exist in the back pages of your books, because I don't have a hyperlink gene in my DNA. And if I really got into one of those, following through some of those links, because I'm an analog person, would have to put on some clothes, walk to the car, drive over to the campus, insert my card key, park, walk to the library, search the stacks, get into the Dewey Decimal System, and finally read whatever secret information he's embedded back there in the back pages of his books. This ability to vault from one topic, actually from a whole universe, to another, becomes apparent with even a cursory reading of Professor Vidler's very, very eclectic resume. It's got a lot of very serious studies on schools, housing. He did a few odd couple collaborations with Eisenman and Frampton at the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies. And every once in a while he veers into esoterica, talking about Ledoux, 18th century architectural theory, stuff like that. During the heyday of Eisenman's I House, which was known at that time very reverentially by everybody who was in New York as the Institute, Professor Vidler was one of the group that included Rem Koolhaas, Ken Frampton, Mario Gondasonis, etc. And together, they all established a viable intellectual beachhead in an architectural profession which at that time, major concern was, the proportions of a curtain wall, and introduced, I think, a very viable conceptual framework into that. In his latest book, Warped Space, he's massaging those little dots again, fracturing and displacing, torquing, twisting, informing us once again of the inherent instability of forms and laws which were once thought sacrosanct, like the law of perspective, for instance, and demonstrating that flexibility, not only of imagination, but of purpose itself, is all too lacking among his comrades. In this, of course, he is also a master folder. He's able to join in words many levels and categories into a seamless, endlessly pleated, and thus coherent reality, in which he balances with equal enthusiasm the work of artists like Rachel Whitehead, Mike Kelly, Baldessari-type people like Martha Rosler, and the by now really famously architectural transgressions of Vito Aconci, people like that, against very Baroque imaginations like Errico and Moss, Reglin, and Dr. Caligari, just for spice. So vaulting through the ages, and I'm going to quote one of his sentences, and I expect you'll hear some more. Tony is apt to put together very, very unlikely combinations. I'm going to quote this sentence. Apparently, there is little to distinguish Alberti's window from a computer screen, as there is to differentiate an 18th century axonometric by Gaspard Monge from a wireframe dinosaur generated by industrial light and magic. That sentence alone conflates not only authorship and media and content, but the very substance of the discourse. A lot of dazzling footwork there, and I hope we get some more tonight. Enjoy.
What am I going to say after that? it's hard to follow someone who knows what you do better than you do yourself. So, very happy to be here tonight, and thanks to you all for inviting me. The title of my talk, provisionally at least, is called Between the Box and the Blob. So we can do... The advent of the digital, the emergence of digital graphics, has changed not only the conditions for the design of buildings and their production methods, but also the very conditions of sight and thought. It's generally accepted that shifts in the mode of representation have historically had consequences in the realm of vision and conceptualization. What Craig referred to just now, the emergence of perspective as a tool and as an idea, is only one obvious example, another being the systematization of geometrical projection in the polytechnic schools of the 19th century, axonometric, isonometric. Both these transformations in representation had a dramatic influence on vision, and consequently on the spatial and structural nature of design. You could write a history of architecture through the lenses of the way in which architecture is represented and therefore conceived and therefore designed. But digitalization, which seems on the evidence of virtual reality screens not to have changed very much, those weak attempts to translate perspective into wireframe projections hardly yet equal to Piero della Francesca's experiments in perspective. In fact, digitalization has changed everything. The German critic Walter Benjamin once remarked that the great transformation of the early 19th century lay in the invention of the technology of iron and glass, materials that impose no limits of their own in the same way as wood or stone, for example, and that was synthetically produced in any shape or form, Gothic or classic. Digitalization represents a similar opening up. There's theoretically no limit to the kinds and types of representation preferred by the computer. No limits of vision with respect to the subject. There is no preferred point of view, as in perspective. No top, no bottom, no scale, only choice. Digitalization transforming the way in which we see by the very speed of possible morphological transformations, of virtual travel, of manipulation. It renders all past modes of vision obsolete, and again without ostensible criteria, internally of judgment and selection. If in the late Renaissance we saw as if through a gridded window, today we see as if through screens. Like William Gibson's Hacker, moving imperceptibly between the real and the virtual, between the space of projection and the space of introjection, as if caught up in a single overwhelming matrix that extends into the space of virtuality behind the screen, so to speak, even as it spreads outward into our own real space. We have the example of our own recent wars in the Gulf and in Kosovo to show the power of look, don't touch or feel, as battles delivered from the air are enacted for the spectacular delight of television viewers by pilots trained to look at their targets as virtual game objectives, directing missiles that guide themselves and photograph themselves as they go in for the kill. In this ambiguous context, the notion of type, of standard, of norm, all of which depend on criteria of so-called rational selection of judgment, of rules, of sets of commonly defined goals and even forms, are thrown into doubt. Questions of type, standard, and norm, which were omnipresent to architects and designers in the 1920s in the face of mass production, housing shortages, and the need to adapt aesthetic canons to machine society, and which returned in a different guise in the 1970s as the theoretical instruments of a new rationalism, have had little resonance in theory and design over the last 20 years or so. Confronted with the endless play of referentiality, spawned by the intersection of semiotic method and postmodern sensibility, with diminishing commissions in housing and urban sectors, and diverted by theories and practice of so-called deconstruction, architects have, in the US at least, preferred to conceive of their buildings as singular, sometimes willfully idiosyncratic constructions that bear little connection to any cultural, formal, or functional continuum, traditional or modern. Ideas of aesthetic, morphological, functional, or technological standards of reception and variation within a theme, of that is, the so-called values once purported to adhere to the rational design of the public and private sphere, the ethics of what modernism called ethics, so to speak, no longer seem to hold the attention of architects more concerned to create dramatic images than to work within a pre-established code. Between modernism and the digital, we are, in a very real way, confronted with a distinct tension, if not contradiction, certainly an opposition between the box and the blob. It was then with a certain hesitancy that I accepted to speak in a lecture series dedicated to the notion of units and aggregates and housing. For it's clear that this is a problem that in architecture at any rate, and in the United States in particular, has from the prominence it had in the high modernist period, enjoyed a rather spectacular decline in popularity. Where even in the 1960s and 70s, questions of urbanism, of housing, of social responsibility and the like took up a great deal of space in architectural curricula, now we seem to be confronted with an emphasis on technology, on individual expression, and the design, trademark, one-off building. If housing is on the agenda at all, it is within the ideological frame of the new urbanism movement, the effects, if not the aims of which seem confined to restricted access developer communities, an oxymoron in every way, got up in nostalgic federal styles to market otherwise ordinary suburban tract housing to an upscale clientele. So how to speak of my own interests in housing when the politics of the day and the culture of the day seems to rule against any investment in the public realm, let alone its architectural fabrication? But on reflection, I began to see an opportunity to explore a topic that, if it has received little attention of late, might in this context be framed in a new and possibly productive way. I speak of the question of typology, once a hot topic in the 1970s, but now hardly mentioned in schools or in offices. Of course, in touching on typology, I run the risk of being seen as a pure historian, always looking at something which is dead, or a nostalgic theoretician, always trying to revive a dead subject. After all, this is a subject that had deeply preoccupied me in the 60s and 70s, one that had infused all my writings on Le Corbusier, on the 18th century, on Ledoux, and the neo-rationalists from Aldo Rossi to Leon Krier and James Stirling. So I take tonight as a kind of challenge to myself, a wager that it might be of more than passing interest to ask the question, what would it be a theory of type or standard in the late 90s? What form might it take? And what role might it play, and especially in the domain of housing? Would such a theory, if it were possible to construe, have any significance given the reduced role of architecture in society, its restriction to the symbolic play of institutional icons and the fashionable replay of retro styles? What would the rational, under the sign of which the typological in all its forms still resides, have to say to the endless repetition of the expressive, the personal, the singular, the one-off? What finally would types have to do with digital representation and production, where in an almost biological fashion, forms can be generated, morphed, and destroyed in a moment, without the resistance of the materials of representation, once controlled by the speed of the hand and the nature of pens and pencils, or from the materials of construction? At first glance, indeed, it seemed so propitious for the development of a revived typological theory. The advanced state of capital in global terms, the equally advanced state of production techniques, of technologies of construction, and most important, the developed state of that most effective of rational tools, the computer, enabling types of all kinds to be manipulated and transformed in series without end at a level of complexity unimaginable to the functionalist 1920s. All this seems to hold the promise of a new typological, hyper-standardized era. And certainly, with regard to the technical aspects of design, what were seen as mere utopian aspirations in the 20s have become a commonplace of the 80s and 90s. Building design, from concept to structural calculation, from overall plan to working detail, can now be computer controlled at every level of interrelationship, through to the production and assemblage of its material parts. What was promise for Le Corbusier in the 1920s is indeed now a reality. Le Corbusier dreamed of a world where the typical need type, or besoin type in French, would quite naturally be supplied by a typical object, objet type in French. He took for his examples the gradual perfectioning of forms, represented by the evolution of auto design. The progress represented by the delage grand sport over the older Humber. Note that the delage grand sport on the right is a French car, superseding the English Humber on the left. This was a speeded up version for him of the progress of Greek Doric architecture from Paestum to the Parthenon. That's Le Corbusier standing beside somebody else's delage grand sport. He could never afford one himself. Even as the Parthenon had emerged as a perfect example of his type to become a standard, so the car had established itself as a type. The ship, the airplane, all products formed by engineering calculation, according to me, were similar. For Le Corbusier, the house should follow this example. The domino house on the right, and one of the earliest housing settlements that he built just after the First World War at Liège on the left. And the house itself should be filled with object types, like those which have evolved perfect forms over centuries. The wine bottle and the French, and the glass, a very French notion of what a type is, but now designed by engineering calculation to fit contemporary needs. Today, following the enormous efforts made in these kinds of areas by institutions like the Bauhaus, such design is ubiquitous. The dramatic example will be the pocket phonograph, 10 centimeters by 4 centimeters on the right, called the Michiphone, and advertised and marketed by Le Corbusier's firm Innovation in 1925. A miracle crafted by the clockmakers of Geneva, but which today, of course, has been realized by the Sony Walkman, the DVD player, and now the MP3 recorder, and soon, with the triumph of Napster, one hopes, we won't even need those. In this respect, then, product design has accomplished the promise of the early Bauhaus, from Braun to Sony. But here lies the first problem for any revived interest in typology, that of an achieved or apparently achieved technological utopia. For where is the need for an aesthetic, purist, rigorous, rationalist theory of types when the consumer market already treats types, series, and norms as changing commonplaces? Or conversely, are we not provided with a plethora of useful types, each modified rapidly according to new needs and possibilities, guided less by the architect than by consumer preference and skillful marketing? Should we necessarily give in to the market and, like the developer, simply call typical what can be manufactured and distributed with the greatest economy and thereby profit? However we answer these questions around the issue of typology in architecture, as opposed to product design, is more difficult to resolve, and bears on the original inner sense of typology, not as a standardization norm, but as a cultural norm. Type, the word, as we know it, entered the vocabulary of rational architects in the late 18th century. For them, as for us, the word held two distinct but sometimes confused meanings. The first was that of a standard, a mathematical, graphical, or formal norm for the shaping of something. This meaning was derived from the original sense of type, typos in Greek, to strike or impress, as in striking a seal, or later, using movable type. This was the meaning that endowed type with a role in mass production. But type was also used in the more allegorical sense of characteristic, and more importantly for architecture, of characterization, to give a building a suitable character. Here was the link, so powerful through the 19th century and in postmodernism, to architecture parlante, or speaking architecture, and thence the debates between character written like physiognomy on a facade, the face of a building, or built into the very organization of the building. Similar debates developed among natural scientists around the question of identification of species. This led, almost imperceptibly, to a second meaning for the word type. one derived from the more idealistic classical tradition out of 17th century Neoplatonism. Here, type was an ideal form or structure, never to be literally realized or copied. Like a Platonic archetype, it resided as a form in the mind. All attempts by artists to attain the perfection of that form were bound to failure, but could be measured in their quality and beauty according to the proximity to the ideal reached by the artist. This idea of type was adapted nicely for 18th century architecture by the sculptor Catherine de Cancy. He took it to mean that every species of building, there existed an ideal type, which he envisaged more as a set of loosely linked relationships of form, space, and structure than any definite pattern. He distinguished type, in fact, from what he called the more literal copy or model. Thus, there was a sort of special curve that ideally accommodated the back and gave proper shape to the chair. But all backs were not the same shape, and therefore not all were chairs. The type of the chair was a curve. Similarly, the semicircular form from Vitruvius on had given an ideal shape to the public theatre, but not all 18th century theatres could or ought to be as perfect as the geometrical type. In this last sense, then, type refers both to building type and to its basic underlying formal order. In this sense, type was envisaged as a cultural norm, established in and subject to change from civilization as it developed more and different needs over time. In a sense, as invented in the 18th century, type was a way of controlling and evidently relativizing history that would, if left to its own devices, do away with all norms in favor of change. Indeed, it is a somewhat optimistic hope that of those who believe that history's own laws operated like those of nature, that historical development would of its own accord produce types that were organically joined to the society they served. And that was, of course, a belief that Le Corbusier shared in. Of course, architects immediately faced the inherent contradiction in this belief, a contradiction faced by the avant-garde in general over the last 2 centuries. On the one hand, history was supposed to work implacably according to its own laws, usually towards progress, but sometimes, in the estimation of some philosophers, towards decay. On the other, the architect was bound to invent types that had never before existed for needs not yet defined by history, in such a way as to follow, organically, the laws of that history. Such, for example, was the dilemma of Carl Friedrich Schickl. I just wanted to show you. Those are two typical forms invented by the 18th century architect Ledoux. This spherical house modeled on the sun, the nurturing form for the shepherds of his ideal city, and the pyramidal forge for forging cannons and weapons in his ideal city. Characteristic type plans like the Vitruvian theater that he actually built in the southeast of France, and then a plan, the iconography of which I haven't worked out, but it's, in his text at least, something to do with plaisir, or pleasure. The dilemma between the organic form of history and the invention of that organic form in architecture to be parallel to and coincide to the laws of history was Schinkel's dilemma at the beginning of the 19th century. As a romantic theorist, he believed in natural organicism. On the other hand, he had to build new types, new kinds of armories, new kinds of opera houses, and new kinds of public institutions like the museum. In the now called Altes Museum, but when he built it, it was called the Neue Museum, Schinkel deliberately fabricated a new type according to newly developed premises of a public gallery and museum. First major museum to be invented out of whole cloth. What he did was he referred to antique architecture by using antique types, but reassembling them to give them new meanings and at the same time serve as guides to those new meanings. Standing across from the Baroque Palace, the whole museum has a Baroque Palace plan with its 2 courtyards. Palace now that was torn down in the 50s and 60s. Thus the Baroque Palace plan of the whole organization as if to emulate that of the old King's Palace across the way. Across the front, not a pedimented temple front, as in the British Museum, but a stoa, a public building from the marketplace in Greece. A stoa to refer to the public role, the accessible role of the new bourgeois culture in the New Berlin in the 1820s and 30s. And then at the center, the Pantheon, cylindrically disposed and domed, inserted at the heart as a reminder of eternal values in the center of a historically arranged display of styles and schools. A completely artificial type form, montaged out of bits of history, so to speak, to represent the organic trace of history itself. Or consider the invention of the library type. Boulez, in the 1780s, seeking to give form to the new idea of the public library, taking Piranesi's engravings of Egyptian libraries, but at the same time referring to Raphael's paintings of the School of Athens with its coffered Albertine vaulting, while coming up with the most economical solution for the site, that is, a large coffered barrel vault linking two sides of already existing buildings. He also claimed that his amphitheater section would allow for the rapid retrieval of books handed down the steps from assistant to his Roman toga clad Enlightenment philosophers. The bottom, the reading room. As we know, both of these invented types, Schinkel's museum and Boulez's library, took hold in the 19th century architectural lexicon and in the 20th century. Le Corbusier was to retain the trace of Schinkel in the plan of his pyramidal world museum, wrapping history in a spiral around a circular precinct representing eternal values. James Stirling was to retrieve Schinkel in a different and more directly referential way at Stuttgart. As for the library, Henri Labrouste was to take Boulez in his dramatic cast iron structure for the Saint-Geneviève Library, the first public library structure in Paris. And once again, on the left, Stirling was to evoke the barrel vault of Boulez's library in his entry for the Bibliothèque de France competition. But perhaps the greatest influence of the idea of type in the last 2 centuries has been in the domain of housing. Here, the most well-known example is that of Le Corbusier. And Le Corbusier is an especially interesting case for us this evening because he not only understood type in the sense of industrial standardization, but also as cultural norm. And it's the tension and the intersection between these two themes that I want to elaborate on in what follows. Certainly, Le Corbusier was a believer in standardization. In fact, he was a strong follower of Frederick W. Taylor, the inventor of Taylorism, standardization, time and motion studies, around the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. It was the 1914-18 war that introduced Frederick Taylor's ideas to Europe. And a French theoretician, Le Chatelier, wrote a book on the new ways of organizing the house, organizing work, organizing the factory that Taylorism represented. He wrote a review on Christine Fredericks. It's one of the most interesting authors of the turn of the century in America. Her book, The New Housekeeping. This young and enthusiastic mistress of the American house wrote Le Chatelier, and claimed that children raised by readers of this domestic manual will certainly later become engineers better prepared than the present generation for the use of the new industrial methods. If you put children in an industrially conceived and rationally laid out kitchen, they will become rational and industrially laid out. 2 years later, in 1916, Le Chatelier published a volume of extracts from Christine Frederick's book in French, to which he contributed an introduction outlining the principles of scientific management, now conceived of as extensions of the dwelling. What is interesting, it's really in the interface between America and Europe that Frederick Taylor's work study theories are applied to the house. Point by point, from organization to science and labor, Le Chatelier extrapolated from the economics of housework to that of industry, repeating his belief that children brought up with scales and clock in the kitchen will develop into natural candidates for industrial managers. Le Corbusier first used the word Taylorism in a letter of 1917, where initially he speaks of Taylorism as the image of the horrible and ineluctable life of tomorrow. But by 1918, he's more optimistic. Taylorism, he said, is no more than a question of intelligently exploiting scientific discoveries. It is the very expression of the modern spirit, l'esprit nouveau, l'esprit moderne, based on the rigorous program of the modern factory. 1918, Le Corbusier wrote, "The war has ended, all is organized, all is clear, all is purified. Factories are built, nothing is like it was before the war. The great struggle tested everything. It destroyed senile methods and replaced them with those which the battle proved best." The very savvy capital relationship between war machines and civil manufacturing development. It was this Taylorism, Le Corbusier thought, that heralded the birth of the new spirit. Wartime production had indeed furnished models that might be applied to the first need of reconstruction housing. In the second number of L'Esprit Nouveau, his own journal, The New Spirit, Le Corbusier admiringly describes the experiment in mass-produced housing conducted by the Voisin Aircraft Corporation, the Maison Voisin, or Voisin houses. Perfect examples of Fordism in the housing domain, built on a belt, on a moving belt. Le Corbusier celebrated the rationalism that had led to a production method that had in turn revolutionized architecture itself. The enunciation of the problem has by itself provided the means of its realization, and here strongly affirms the immense revolution undergone by architecture. When the manner of building is modified to such an extent, automatically the aesthetic of construction finds itself overturned, he wrote. The imperatives of post-war reconstruction that demanded houses, he said, that emerged totally formed, made with machine tools, in the factory, fabricated like Ford assembles the pieces of his cars on his, what they charmingly called in French, rolling carpets. The aircraft industry had pioneered this process. And after all, as Le Corbusier said, an aircraft is nothing more than a small house that flies. Soldier architects were by these means enabled to construct complete houses in 3 days and transported by road. The dwellings are habitable 3 hours after being sited. These Voisin aircraft houses, mass-produced like cars or airplanes, were harbingers of a new order. Le Corbusier challenged. To inhabit such houses, one must have the spirit of a wise man and be animated with this new spirit. A generation is born that will soon know how to inhabit these aircraft houses. If Fordism can produce entire houses, the revolution in their aesthetic was to be advanced by a minute taylorization of every aspect of their interior planning. Beginning with the 20th issue of L'Esprit Nouveau, Le Corbusier provided rhapsodic annotations to advertisements for the domestic furnishing from his own design firm, Innovation, as if it were the agent that might tailorize the entirety of life, from the armoire to the house itself. An advertisement for built-in closets begins in Le Corbusier's words with the message, "The war has woken us up. We speak of Taylorism. It's done. It's now in the house." Taylorism in these terms will revolutionize not only the mentalities of workers and managers, but their entire domestic environment. The firm Innovation introduces pivoting and expanding racks for economic storage in wardrobes, tie hangers like cartwheels, built-in closets that generate new philosophy of the wall, and for the industrial nomad, traveling trunks that fold out into complex storage closets. From the object that acts as extension of the human limbs, objects which are our tools, to spatial layouts and new methods of construction. Le Corbusier's firm Innovation will Taylorize the world. The war has shaken off our stupor. One spoke of Taylorism. It was accomplished. The contractors have bought ingenious machines, patient and agile. Will the building sites soon become factories? The house will no longer be that enormous thing cut up by fortress walls, pretending to defy the centuries. It will become a rigorous tool, in the same way as a precise car becomes a tool of work. Benefiting from a century of science, of calculation and industry, it will open itself in its smooth and nervous resistance to the infinite combinations required by infinitely more refined and precise needs, the consequence of an overarching revolution led by the law of economy. And Le Corbusier builds his own mass-produced housing types at Pessac for the manufacturer and philanthropist Henri Frouzès. And he advertises his houses under the sign of Taylorism. Taylorism that expands from the fittings inside the house, the furniture of the house itself, to houses built like cars. That advertisement for Citroën we'll see is not an idle allegory. To houses that are units that will then be aggregated into larger units. So much for standardization. And yet at the same time, type for Le Corbusier was also a cultural form and norm. For the mass-produced house, the example of the car, already given as the contemporary equivalent of the Parthenon standard in Vers en Architecture, so we have what he calls the maison Citroën, or house like a car, and it looks indeed like a car. But spatially, of course, the type here is not just that of a car ready to move. It is also that of the two-story generic artist studio in Paris, one that is to be repeated in every different house type, from the immeuble villa to the Marseille block. I hope you see the cultural norm here too. The Marseille block is not just a Citroën house inserted into a frame to make the aggregate of the Marseille block. It's also a bottle in a wine rack. Again, French culture triumphs. The welding of a machine idea to a cultural form, or rather ideal, in the manner of every man, in the manner of William Morris, who imagined every man an artist. And with the villas, as the historian Colin Rowe has demonstrated in 1949, Corbusier takes on an already typical layout perfected by Palladio and Neo-Palladianism, that of the villa in the Veneto. Thus his house at Gâches, as you can see here, these are the villa types identified by Rudolf Vickover in his Architectural Principles in the Age of Humanism, and here is Colin Rowe's comparison of the Villa Malcontenta and the Villa at Gâches, where he makes the point that the same regularity, rhythm of A, B, A, major bays and service bays, major bays and service bays, and the same vestigial centrality, but blown apart in the peripheral working of Le Corbusier's transformation of the static Renaissance centralization into something that is moving and spiraling out into the modern world. And as we know, the Villa Malcontenta and the Villa Savoie at Poissy, the Villa Rotunda and the Villa Savoie at Poissy. In all these transformations of types, antique and modern, there is the implication that a new generation will utilize the idea and fact of type, not simply as an authorization of the new in relation to the old, but more as a critical concept, allowing for the transformation of former types to give a critical edge, so to speak, to the invention of new types. Typology in these terms would not just be standardization, but also would be critical of culture rather than an imitative practice. And what are these types recently? We find the library of Perrault emptily echoing the quasi-transparent towers of Le Corbusier's imaginary palace, while parroting the notion of architecture parlante in the equally empty forms of the towers as open books. We all know the difficulties that this sterile reliance on type as caricature, as an easy way out, has led to. As for museums, they take every form under the sun, from Liebeskin's definitely not typological Museum of Jewish History to Frank's even more non-typological Guggenheim Museum of Bilbao. As for the house, a glance at contemporary practice in Los Angeles would satisfy even the most avid seeker for types, that save for the ubiquitous developer tract house. Typology is all but disappearing from the scene, until you do your projects, of course. There is one space in the realm of the individual house, however, that gives one a sense that the notion of type has not yet given up all of its potential of criticality. There are many contemporary houses, not all of them represented in the Unprivate House exhibition, some of them were, where the notion of type, working on the notion of house in the 20th century modernist context, has transformed itself into a kind of critical spatial structure. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. I'll give you an example you know very well, the example of Rem Koolhaas, who's long an outspoken admirer and critic of Corbusian dreams, and his recently completed house at Bordeaux. Here, under the guise of a small garden pavilion, Koolhaas has constructed a complicated and brilliant commentary on modernism that nevertheless propels the architectural discourse beyond mere witty comment or simple caricature. Now we know that Le Corbusier transformed, as John Summerson has pointed out, wittily reversed and turned upside down all the verities of house and home. In his villas, the house is put on stilts rather than on foundations, the garden is put on the roof rather than around the house, the continuous strip window is maintained in order to demonstrate the lack of load-bearing walls, the periphery is privileged over the center, and so on and so forth. If Le Corbusier did that to the contemporary, to the traditional house of Palladio through to the Beaux-Arts, Koolhaas has, I think, inverted once more the Corbusian type as found at Poissy, without in any way reverting to the formal traditional model. Thus, Koolhaas's house is not on pilotis, but is a beam, balanced, seemingly precarious around the fulcrum. The main level is not open, but closed. These are just, this is the garden on the roof in the Poissy villa on the right, and in Rem's Bordeaux house, the garden is not on the roof, but buried in the ground. The house is not served at its center by a ramp that connects all the levels in aerobic fashion, like the Corbusian ramp, but it's built around a space that itself moves up and down at the will of its inhabitant, the study as elevator. There's the internal courtyard of the Koolhaas villa, the kitchen level, the living level, and the bedroom level. So all the solids and voids that were characteristic of Corbusier and, of course, of Mies are inverted and transformed in this very elegant and witty reconstruction. The other interesting thing about the house is that it's an incredibly, and this is something very close to Rem's heart, it's an incredibly post-Nietzschean house. It's actually a rather terrifying little machine. When we visited it a year ago, you know the story, of course, that the owner of the house during the design phase suffered a terrible accident and became a quadriplegic. And the house then is somehow constructed on the one hand, in a very humanist way to serve all his needs. The study goes up and down as an elevator, the back of the house is constructed like a kind of hospital, and so on and so forth. Actually, when you visit the house, there's another aspect to it that comes out, which is very Rem. There's a number of things happened. The house was in the process of being transformed into a large party structure for the coming out party of one of the daughters of the house. And a extremely avant-garde and radical techno band was setting up its metal instruments all through and around the house itself. And so the house itself, as we came up to it, it was the metal house, as you can see, was making these noises. And then the angle of that glass is such that you can't actually, when you get up close to it, you can't see it reflecting. It's pitched slightly. So my 8-year-old son ran straight for it and into it and lost a tooth. And so the blood is probably still there. Then inside, you see the house. Inside the house, as you can see, there's that study that goes up and down as an elevator. There's a large black beam which is lower than everywhere else. And I was just leaning over to look down the elevator and smashed my head on the large black beam. And the lady of the house came to me with great affection and said, you've bashed your head on the beam, in very elegant French, and that you have immediately become a friend of the house. Everyone in this house hurts themselves. There are, all the stairs just plunge down, and there are no edges to the stairs. And during the creation of this party, of course, they were terrified that guests would break their necks falling into these pits, so they carefully arranged bolts of firewood and stones and flares around the stairs in order to mark them. The big circular windows at the front are windows to the girls' bedroom. They have no guardrails, so I was told by the daughters that they were not really keen on sleepwalking, because when they're open, you just go straight out. This is the hospital wing of the house, that is the bedroom and the bathroom. Rem has transformed the machine à habiter, the machine, or dwelling machine of Le Corbusier, into a machine à survivre, a machine to survive. A complicated and extended prosthetic mechanism that is half hospital for the man of the house and half panopticon for his family. That is, he's still in the center, observing his family and being observed by his family. A viciously cruel house, with sharp edges of glass, vertigo spaces, and danger at every turn. A house with no guardrails, no safety features, no comfort. A post-Nietzschean, post-Superman house, ironic and cutting in its allegorical and literal humor. Perhaps a suitable new type for the end of a not-so-comforting century. Perhaps it's in works like this that we can sense a still experimental typological ethic, a still rigorous theory, a still inventive typology, even though individualized. One that works within history while recognizing its fading force, its weakened powers, its need for quick wit and self-criticism. Koolhaas gives us a clue that the question of typology resides not so much in the blind fascination with new technologies of representation or construction, but in the premises of the architecture itself, as it seeks to make critical contact with its own past while preserving its absolute contemporaneity. It is in this context that we might be able to refabricate the issue of typology, in terms that both related to the traditional forms and functions of housing, and at the same time recognize the potential of the revolution that I spoke of at the beginning, the digital revolution. For after all, the digital is only what we ask it to be. Its aesthetic, dominated up to the present by software commands and the all-too-easy replication of surface attributes, surfaces stretched over wire frames, can be directed and reduced to a minimal instruction base that allows for the wireframe to reassume its former function as diagram of organization. Its program, controlled by the selected input information, can be likewise construed as a response to social and environmental issues beyond any formalistic play of circuits and topologies. Digitalization could in fact allow for the perfection of modernist programs for housing in its acceptance and utilization of a complexity hitherto unimaginable. Imagine, for example, what housing architects of the 20s and 30s could have accomplished with the programs of today. Functionalism would, in a sense, have won. Ultimately, of course, the question can be returned to the political, beyond the formal and the technological. Political in the sense of resource allocation, of the will to plan, of the return to the multi-unit dwelling as an appropriate type for early 21st century design. Perhaps in conclusion, alongside the exciting generation of skins, morphologies, and blobs, we might consider harnessing the analytical powers of digitalization to social as well as formal use. To rejoin, that is, a technological and standardized idea of type to its contemporary cultural equivalent. And I want to leave you with this, what I think is a quite interesting and model example of a paradigmatic play on typology, digitalization, and the actual social and political questions involved in both and their application to domesticity. It's a project that was installed in the Fondation Cartier by Elizabeth Diller and Riccardo Scafidio 2 years ago. As you know, Diller and Scafidio have established a practice that insistently interrogates the routines, visual and practical functions of the everyday through a series of objects, site-specific constructions, performance works, video installations, and architectural projects. Perhaps the most dramatic of these, in terms of its critique of domestic culture, was the Slow House, an ironic commentary on the cult of the picture window, where a space shaped like a warped telescope expanded to end in a picture window overlooking a view, at the center of which was a video screen that continuously played back pre-recorded versions of this view to the inhabitants inside. Other installations from New York to San Francisco have developed this critique of surveillance cameras by playing back in real time the view of visitors to museums and civic centers to themselves. But the new domestic landscape has received no more witty critique than that presented by the installation recently designed for the Fondation Cartier, where an entire gallery occupying half the entrance floor was taken up with a project conceived to display the collection of toy robots assembled over the last decades by Rolf Fellbaum, the director of the Vitra Gallery in Basel. Taking their inspiration from the nature of these robots, broken, wind-up, and battery-drive toys from Japan and elsewhere, dating from the robot fever years of the 50s and 60s, Diller and Scafidio designed a house for their retirement, where in their metaphorical and functional lives, robots were envisaged as at once the ultimate mechanical slaves and all-seeing eyes. Now these worn-out and technologically obsolete objects were themselves subjected to continuous camera and X-ray surveillance as they moved jerkily and slowly on a moving belt from basement to living room, tripping electronic switches that stopped them at defined moments, thence to be photographed and displayed on an array of screens from the public. At once a metaphor for the surveillance that we all undergo daily in supermarkets and banks, homes and gardens, and a witty inversion of the robot's once powerful role, turning the tables on technology, so to speak, this installation gained further strength from its evident play with architectural motifs. It was perhaps no accident that this robot house bears a distinct resemblance to that paradigm of modernist domesticity, Le Corbusier's Villa Savoie at Poissy. But where at Poissy, the horizontal box raised up on stilts and connected vertically by a centrally placed ramp was intended as a kind of fitness machine for the aerobic exercise and health of the modulo man invented by Le Corbusier as his post-Nietzschean paradigm of bodily and mental superiority, here at Cartier, the robots are fixed to their ramp that incessantly moves them like pawns from lower to upper level and scrutinizes their identity at every stop on the way. Where at Poissy, the raised living level is surrounded by horizontal bands of windows and openings calculated to frame the view from inside to outside, creating a kind of camera obscura. for the inhabitant to construct infinite space in perspective. Now in the Cartier project, the living space is placed at the spectator's eye level and, lit with a greenish and uncannily hothouse-like fluorescent light, is displayed solely for the view from the outside in. Here what was seen first as the potential of the modernist humanist subject to oversee and control its own territory from its domestic castle is now seen as a completely reversed condition, where the domestic interior is transformed into an entire landscape to be visually controlled from the outside. That's the section is almost exactly the same as the section of Poissy, in fact. Where finally at Poissy, the top garden level is planned as a private solarium for the ultimate privacy and recreation of the modernist body. Here at Cartier, the roof of the installation is occupied by a single rogue robot, turning round and round in a fixed loop, doing nothing but vainly teaching French to the French visitors. Dedicated in this way to tautology, to fixed loop paths, and impartial surveillance techniques, all controlling the jerky, out-of-date robotic figures of thrown-away toys, this installation frames the contemporary condition of domestic security culture in two ways. On the one hand, it operates as a machine for thinking about this condition and our own place within it, as we act robotically as if nothing had changed, as we see ourselves daily on camera and invest in our own security systems at home, systems that not only monitor theft but also turn our houses into robotic servants. I remember I had to install one of these systems a few years ago, and the salesman came up and he said, "Do you realize that what our system can do that no other system can do? Do you realize that in coming back from the university on sunset, 10 minutes before you reach home, you can program this little device so that by the time you get home, your security system will not only open the garage door as you approach, but will always also have made the coffee." On the other hand, through the gentle irony of its subjects, the broken toys, the Cartier installation diffuses much of the hysterical hype that sees in this new surveillance culture something entirely without precedent, and fails to understand its deep roots in the earlier modernist culture of machinism. The quaint and already nostalgic landscape of the Jetsons has therefore been both registered and reframed in the contemporary context in order to cause us to reflect, not so much on the identity of robot after robot as they pass through the seemingly endless checkpoints and security scans, but on our own place in the world we see mirrored in the screens displaying the robot's statistics. A world in which we have already, almost without knowing it, and certainly with our partial complicity, been transformed into so much data, digitally and continuously revised. What we witness with ironic pleasure and some fear in the Fondation Cartier is the process of our own digitalization. It was, I think, those are the x-rays of the robots. It was, I think, significant that on the opening night, Jean Baudrillard and Paul Virilio, the French pundits of the virtual, were seen in real attendance, arguing vociferously in front of the robot house. One imagines that their conversation turned on the failure of their own personal theories of robotics and cyberspace in the face of a machine that celebrated their inevitable obsolescence. It's probably much more likely that they were comparing notes on the relative efficiency of the Parisian concierge as opposed to digital security systems. Thank you very much. Discussions.
Does anyone have any questions?
Questions? I touched on a number of different themes, all of which I think in some way intersect around the question of how you deal with the contemporary house, domestic, standardized, tailorized, and culturally iconic.
So where do we go from here?
Aha. Well, that's... You mean in terms of a project for constructive design, or in terms of critique of the present?
No, critique at all. I'm talking about
how you
we proceed from
how you
here.
proceed. Well, I think what I try to emphasize is that it's the two modes of procedure that modernism proposed, when they split apart, become very easily absorbed on the one hand by a kind of standardized housing market, right? Where if the house is treated only as standardization, it becomes simply an economic and not a political or social unit. And if the house becomes only a cultural icon, it becomes solely, if you like, prey of fashionable style facades. So the question is how to weld together significant understanding of the cultural place of the house, and at the same time the new technological possibilities, both in design and in production of houses, that are emerging in the late 20th and early 21st century. So I think that basically the question is that somehow these two critical models, which both, in a sense, the Koolhaas-Diller models don't give you plans for action, but they do give you a moment where the technology of realizing the house and the cultural significance of house in a technological world come together.
Thank you.
But
It seems to me, though, that in forums like these, the human aspect is totally forgotten. When they create a form for the sake of the form, it seems to me that the humanity is taken totally out of it.
Well, of course, there are in a range of multiple different cultures, very different definitions of quote-unquote what is the form for humanity. Some cultures are much more tied to a sense of the forms that have traditionally nurtured their quote-unquote humanity, and other cultures, and I think in many areas of Western Europe, after many decades of modernism and modern architecture, feel that modernism is their humanity. The people who bought the house at Bordeaux were the people who were the same humans, so to speak, as employed Corbusier to build the house of Poissy. So in a sense, I think there are different versions of what quote unquote humanity might be at any moment in any particular culture. So I think you're right that to imagine that this is a universal solution for every particular culture and locality would be not correct.
But another thing is that a house like you showed us of Koolhaas, it could be not just in France, it could be on the moon as far as I'm concerned, and still function on its own right. In other words, it doesn't seem to me that it distinguishes between different places of existence.
How would you distinguish between different places? For example, there are a lot of houses in very elegant and turn of the 1920s, 1930s Spanish red-tiled style that I find in the south of France, in Miami and in Los Angeles. It's hard for me to know where they are if I take them out of their context. It's very hard to know if I take the office building, for example, no matter what efforts were made in the last 10 to 15 to 20 years to personalize office buildings by sort of signature facades. The actual office building is very much the same, whether it's in Los Angeles or London or Tokyo or Hong Kong. It seems to me that we're dealing with a culture which is rather insistent about its tendency to standardize whether we like it or not. And the question is, at certain moments, to confront that and to turn that, if you like, into a way of if you like, aesthetically controlling universality, rather than simply papering, you know, a so-called local style on the front of something which underneath is the same box frame. I don't know. I tend to, you know, be very sort of ambivalent about questions of locality, questions of place, and questions of, you know, production and manufacture. In the end, every single so-called place or community that is developed in developer land, it seems to me it's pretty much the same in Cincinnati as it is in Los Angeles, as it is in, God forbid, New Jersey.
So with digital taking over as it is it appropriate then for us to create, for the sake of typology, box shape bubbles?
Well, I guess what I'm suggesting is that there are with every new, when Renaissance perspective came sort of bursting into sort of interest in the 15th century, artists just could not stop themselves playing with perspective. Right? I mean, they just did all kinds of tricks with foreshortening. Mantegna did the foreshortening of the bodies and so on and so forth. And there were extraordinary, prolific experiments in trying out what perspective could do. Right? At a certain moment, the most, if you like, the most successful perspective paintings were those which were less concerned with what perspective could do than they were with controlling perspective to do something. Do you see what I'm saying? And I think that one of the moments that we've reached a moment in the development of the digital, right? And by the digital, I'm not just talking about the aesthetic representation that you can get from a particular software morphing or animation program. I'm also talking about the underlying system of thought that allows you to code information in different ways and to bring, for example, structural information into design shell information, into formal information, into color and texture, and to code it all so that the design responds simultaneously to different weightings of that information. I think we've reached a moment where it is important now to think what it is that we are using digitalization for. Right? It can do almost anything for us. Right? It can design boxes, or it can design blobs. But just because digitalization can design blobs doesn't seem to me to take the responsibility out from under our feet as thinking critical designers from actually developing quite rigorous criteria for the use of digitalization. And I'm suggesting that those criteria are not simply technological introduced in relationship to standardization, but they are also cultural in relationship to the ways in which culture signifies through its environment, and they are political and social above all in terms of the way in which materials are deployed to solve particular questions in housing, habitat, and institutions. So what I feel has happened in the sort of educational process in architecture schools, and I am the first, as Craig will know, to defend and push, you know, the digitalization to the sort of, if you like, almost the whimsical avant-garde edge, right? But I think that what has been lost in the learning and the experimenting with these technologies and techniques is the underlying reason that we use them for. right? And that sometimes the technology of representation takes over from the thought and constructs that we want to represent. It's a very simple message, actually. And I think that it is actually time to begin to think about the fact that whether we like it or not, housing is standardized and typologized. Whether we like it or not, all the building industry does it, you know, almost sort of automatically according to a law of consistent economy in relationship to development, right? And if we are going to be effective in using the tools that we've learned to design with, we have to fundamentally confront questions of the politics, economics, and culture of housing in an age where housing is not quite the same as it used to be. Does that?
Can you take one more question?
Yeah, before I drop a 13-day hunger.
Well, actually, that sort of leads a little bit into a question that I had when you were talking about standardization, and that some of the last few examples that you showed, I would say probably speak more to like an elite type of architecture as opposed to standardization. And just maybe if you could speak a little bit about that, I mean, showing those examples as opposed
Well,
to...
I think, yes, obviously the two projects I showed you were fundamentally elite. But what I find interesting in sort of elite avant-garde architecture when it's intelligent is that it's the moment when, if you like, architecture allows itself to become self-critical, right? I mean, if we are concerned in sort of real time in the real world with real projects that at a certain moment have fundamental impact on a culture or a society, like building some development or refurbishing an area of the city. We, in a sense, I think properly and quite ethically, withdraw from a certain level of experiment, because that level of experiment at that point is either not affordable or, you know, you can't afford to play, right, with that at that level. So I look on these projects, one sort of represses one's sort of sense of world injustice and social and class struggle in order to gain from those projects moments of where the intersection of a quick-witted architect and an opportunity to, if you like, play freely, right, forms a kind of critical nexus that allows us to reflect on questions of domesticity, surveillance, modernization, and